Hi, I'm Peter Hill, and this is the D-Word podcast, where we talk dementia. Welcome along to another D-Word podcast. The traditional view of day care is a big group in a building somewhere doing joint activities. This week's guest, Libby Price, decided to turn that on its head and came up with the Filo Project. We'll be hearing all about that shortly, but first of all, how did Libby get involved in working with people living with dementia?
Well, I guess it's a very good question, actually. It's something I haven't really thought about for quite a long time. I think, you were just talking about how you in another role you did whatever you did, and then you stopped that and you started something else. I've always said that life is about chapters, and what you do in your 20s, your younger years, isn't necessarily what you do later. And I think that's the wonderful thing about a life journey. I trained in the theatre. I was a stage manager. I then went on to have a large family. I've got 5 children, which took up a decade. I then trained I learned to be a garden designer in my 40s. And when I got to my 50s, my children were older, all sort of secondary school age and so on. And I suppose you have the financial thrust of life is perhaps a little less when you get to that age. And I was looking for some more sort of vocational work, and I started working with Age UK in Exeter, and they had a model of care that was one of their many how which was called neighbourhood daycare, and I became a host for them. And I realised that how much I loved being involved with older people. I found the people with memory loss fascinating because I realised just how much they could still do and still be. And I think it's really interesting, actually. I haven't thought about this for a long time, but I don't have parents. I lost my parents a long time ago. And I think subconsciously, I probably I enjoy the company of older people who would be perhaps my parents' age. I then met Liz, my co-director, who was looking to do some field work for her part of her PhD. And she was working with Exeter University, and she came along to my days that I used to host, and for 6 months and twice a week, and we developed quite an interesting relationship. We're very different people, but we've got a great friendship, and we both have a common vision. We determined that we felt we could do a lot more than just me doing what I was doing, and we knew that Age UK was going to shut down the service because it wasn't viable. Age UK Exeter, that is. It was very much postcode defined, and we realised that what I was doing was too good just to stop. So why don't we embrace the research side and the practical side with the outcomes that we were seeing, the benefits, the positives, and the joy that we could see. We sort of then got cracking, and it happened to be at a time when local authorities were shutting day centres and care homes, and this was 9 years ago. So that's how the Filo Project came to be, and I came to be at the helm with Liz, really, essentially.
Filo Project, tell me about the name. Where did that come from?
Well, it was quite funny, actually, because we couldn't think of a name, and I'm slightly allergic to the imagery that you often see in marketing for older people. So you see the very elderly withered hand and a young hand holding it. I don't like that. That's just subjective, but I don't like it. I also don't like names that suggest almost a condescension. So I know it's not meant negatively, but I wanted something, and Liz and I both felt strongly that we wanted a name for our organisation that would be perhaps a bit different. And we couldn't think of what to call it, and we ended up. Liz said to me in my kitchen one day, "Well, come on, Libby, what do you have in your mind?" And I said, "Well, if you imagine, I just imagine building up layers, and something substantial comes of those layers, such as you would have perhaps when you make a strudel." Right. So this imagery of phyllo pastry becomes a strudel. Well, we couldn't really call it the strudel, a slightly awkward name, and also with sort of Germanic connotations might not have been the best sort of for the particular age cohort that we support. So we started calling our files on Dropbox and, spreadsheets, Filo 1, Filo 2, Filo 3. And then I said to Liz, well, actually, it felt quite comfortable. And so let's stick project on the end, because it's always going to be a work in progress. It's always going to be evolving. Let's call it the Filo Project. And that's where it came from. What's really interesting, Peter, is that we've subsequently discovered that in ancient Greek, philo, spelled slightly differently, means love and care. And I use it quite a lot when I do talks about memory loss or the memory, peeling back the layers of short-term memory, which don't work so well, but then you reveal the layers that are still intact, and that's long-term memory. So I've found it a really lovely imagery for talking to people with dementia about, and they love that word. They love the philo. They call it their philo days. They remember it. Even if they can't remember a great deal, they remember their philo day, and that's incredibly important. So that's where that comes from.
Yeah, I think it's, it describes it perfectly. I mean, the traditional model of daycare, as I think you alluded to a little bit earlier, is the day centre. It's the minibus that picks you up to take you to the day centre. With the Alzheimer's Society, I was involved a little bit in that world. But looking at what you do, I mean, you've looked at it very closely, and this is a really alternative model, isn't it?
It is, and it's proved to be very sustainable as well. I think it's particularly successful because it's very popular with the people that come. So people aren't just dumped with us, as often is the case. A big centre can offer, no matter how well intentioned, it's a big centre. So it might have between 10, 15, 20 people there. It could be of mixed needs. So you might have learning disabilities with dementia. And I think there are so many ironies in that kind of environment, because if you think about what it is to live with dementia, and very typically and most often with short-term memory loss, depositing somebody in a room with 15, 20 other people is actually probably very alarming. And you're not sure why you're there, and you can't remember why you've been told perhaps, but you can't remember why you're there. You're picked up. You mentioned transport. Absolutely. Generic transport, binny buses going around the houses with 6, 7, 8 people stopping, starting. It's not very personal. I don't think it's particularly productive.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
This is the D-Word podcast with my guest, Libby Price from the Filo Project. It obviously is a much smaller model which revolves around the hosts and their own homes. That's the bit I know, but if you could explain a little bit more around that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So we employ hosts. They're not volunteers. We're very clear that people working in the work, doing the work we do, should not just be regarded as volunteers. In order to be sustainable, we need people to be committed, not just intentionally, but to be working with us. So they're paid very well. They have 6 weeks holiday a year, so they have really good. It's a very good employment. But what they do in their job is they will, in their own home, host small groups for the day, and they will provide the transport for that group where they can. So if somebody is not able to get into a conventional car, then that might negate them being able to come in a host car, but there might be other ways of getting them there. But the host will go out and pick up his or her clients for the day. So it feels like you're going out with friends. So the host comes, the host is the same person, known to the family, known to that if somebody's living alone, it's that person that they may not remember the name, but there will be a sense of familiarity, of regularity, repetition. Those things are really important. And so say somebody comes on a Tuesday, the host will pick up on a Tuesday. It's the same host, and takes them back to their home. And what we try and do is maximise those windows of respite that also are a byproduct of the days that we provide. So if we know that there's a carer who's really struggling, then we'll try and pick up that client first to maximise the window of respite. And a lot of people love the journey, because we shouldn't always judge by our own standards, which is, perhaps I could say I spend far too long in the car. For some people who never go out or aren't allowed to drive anymore, can't drive anymore, to go out and have a journey is a lovely thing to do. And even if it's pouring with rain, it's quite interesting. And we see the seasons. We live in Devon, and we support in Devon, Somerset, Cornwall, Lancashire, and people enjoy getting to see the scenery, see the daffodils in February, or the magnolias out and the whatever. It's lovely. And so we're piled back to the host's home. And what do you do when you've got friends round? You put the kettle on. And that's always the starting place. And you might sit around a kitchen table, having a cup of coffee, some biscuits. And it's collaborative. So it's very much care not being done to. So the people who come for our clients, our guests, our beneficiaries, whatever you like to say, they will be part of determining what's going to happen that day. And it's based on what they can do still, their preferences, their capacities, and their personalities. Those are the key three ingredients. And the day will unravel accordingly. So we're not activity-led. We're slightly allergic to that, a script that is one size fits all, because somebody might have a dementia, but also have sensory loss. So they may have macular disease and not be able to see something that's being done. They can't see that to join in. They might have hearing impairment, so they can't hear to do certain things. So we try and make, each group will be different to another group. So it'll unravel separately. And lunch is a huge part of it, because many people don't have that joy of breaking bread with one another. And what we do is sitting around a table. What do we do with our friends and family? We put the world to rights. We have good banter. We chat. And it's amazing what happens over a meal table, I think, often. And again, that can be collaborative. People like to help. Just because somebody can't do a great deal anymore, a lady who a farmer's wife might have been preparing food for 55 years can still enjoy peeling the carrots and podding, the broad beans or whatever, and being a part of something again. And we find that this involvement, and it's significant that it isn't care done to, it's care done with, is hugely valuable. And then, after lunch, sit down and banter again, conversation. It's the conversation that's incredibly important, because that is what brings people back from being isolated. It's being talked to, human connection in real time.
Yeah, I think, the care done with thing, I think is so important, because, I go back to my environment with the Alzheimer's Society. Was very much, we will provide the entertainment. And it was quite obvious, having 18 people in the room, that there are certain people that think, oh, this is brilliant. Other people think, what is going on? And other people think, I don't like this at all. So, with a small group, you have the ability to actually, we had guys who want to talk about football. We had ladies who want to talk about this. And put 18 people in the room, it's a nightmare. But, you put 4 people in a nice, conducive environment, it must be so much better.
It is. And the thing is, it works. I mean, this is the key. We know it works because we built up from 9 years ago. I was the host. I was running 2 groups, and we now have just shy of 100 groups running a week, and we employ 93 people, I think. So we've able to, the ripple effect has been huge. We're not postcode defined, so we can go wherever there's a need, we will go. There are groups that, as long as we've got the right people applying to work with us, and we never seem to have a shortage of people coming forward, which is wonderful. We will go so we work again quite collaboratively with the organisations that are, statutory and otherwise, who know where they want us to go. So that's been a really interesting journey, actually.
Certainly. I mean, you got 93 hosts. I mean, what's their
So
background?
93, that's 93 people in the organisation, so not all hosts. So
Right.
something, I think just over 70 hosts, and then we have area coordinators. So as we grow in an area, for example, Exeter is where I started, we now have, I think, 11 hosts. And we have an area coordinator and somebody else who helps with client assessments. We now have an office, an HQ with 5 people. We have every different area has an area coordinator. So as we have grown, our structure of support grows with it. So it's manageable. And nothing gets too big. That's what the joy is. We don't get greedy. We don't say, oh, well, let's get 9 in a group because that will give us more money. We're not driven by profit. We're a not-for-profit company, although we're a business. So we have to turn over money in order to pay our staff what we want to pay them, and all that side of it. So it's a business from that perspective. But instead of just cramming more people in and negating the value, we just have more groups. So it's very, a host will start with 1 group and quickly move to 2. That's fairly normal. Most hosts do 2 days a week, and it's a nice part-time job for many people.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, it is a very nice and, really pleasurable thing to do. And I guess, it increases the links with the local community. And as you say, someone gets picked up in a car instead of having the stigma of being picked up in a big bus with something written along the side. And it must be like just visiting friends.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, it's obviously quite carefully constructed, as a good Filo parcel would be, but we don't want people coming to feel that. We want them to feel that it is a day out with friends. It doesn't have that stigma. You mentioned the word stigma. There's so much stigma relating to a dementia journey. I think it's the language we use. So often people just don't realise the language they use. And the irony for me often is that a really good friend of mine said, many years ago, when her mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, that she said, Libby, there's nothing as bad as a diagnosis. The diagnosis is a terrible time. I mean, obviously, subsequent months and of death are obviously very traumatic also, but you have a time to prepare as that goes on. But to be told in a room that you have something pretty catastrophic is a terrible shock. And so imagine what that's like for somebody with dementia who forgets and told they have dementia. And how does that make them feel? Awful, panicky. I never thought this would happen to me. And then they forget, and then they're told again that they've got dementia, and again and again. And that's something I find really challenging. I don't know why we have to use that word so often to people. We can talk about dementia. We're talking about it, you and I, today, but do we need to talk about it over somebody who has dementia? Or could we use I'll share that with you. It's quite funny, actually. I went to a lovely memory cafe a few years ago in a place called Budleigh Salterton. I don't know whether you know Budleigh Salterton, but it's on the east coast of Devon, on the Jurassic coast. And it's fondly known as God's waiting room because the average age has always been rather elderly. So the memory cafe, it had a lot of people in their 80s and 90s. And I was invited to go and do a talk. And normally a talk would involve carers and cared for. But in this case, it was just the people with the memory loss, no carers. So they said, would you like to talk to the group? And I thought, well, I'm not going to start talking about dementia to them or daycare, because I thought that's just, I don't know. I just felt it was the wrong thing to do. Wasn't comfortable doing that. So I sort of likened memory. We talked about, I said, a car comes off the production line and it's nice and shiny and new and everything works. But over time, things get a bit rusty and we knew it needs a few new parts, and they all related to that hugely. And they thought it was hilarious. And, the exhaust might fall off and, and it became a very interactive conversation, and we all understood what we meant. It's about aging, and dementia comes in so many different ways, as you know. I just think we have to be careful about the language we use. And the word daycare is quite stigmatizing. It conjures up a quite unfortunate imagery, I think, for many people. For a lot of men, they're very difficult to engage in the notion of daycare. Their perception quite rightly, really, of old, was that it's a lot of women sitting around and chatting and what have you. But they love men. We have as many men in our service as women because they enjoy that small group banter. It's not one-to-one, which a lot of men find anyway quite awkward, just being in a one-to-one scenario. And I also say, let's not judge men and say men want to be with men. Men might like to be with other men. It might be a real good blokes group, with, that's really, we have a lot of groups like that. But equally, there may be a man who's lost his wife and he's lonely and he's alone, but he likes female company. So he benefit from being with women. So we look at every person coming as an individual. We don't just say, yes, we've got a place on a Tuesday, bang. We say, okay, we've got 3 options. Let's see where we can best fit James or Frank or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So it is very much a bespoke service.
Yeah, I think that, he's looking at the individual. I think sometimes other services, I don't want to criticise anybody, but they don't have the time to actually do that. And I think that's, the important essence. And what you were saying about, the language that we use, hence, it's twofold really, the title of this show, because the D word is D because it's something still that people find it difficult to talk about. But the other reason why it's the D word is when I was actually running activity groups, I used to say to carers and family members who dropped off their loved one with us, I said, by the way, you will realise that when we go into the room there, the one word we don't mention, and they used to look at me and I used to say, well, dementia. Because I'm sorry, this isn't Dennis with dementia. This is Dennis.
This is Dennis. He's lived a life. He's got
exactly.
His life will be rich. And I think, it's also not judging people by what our perception of somebody is. I think that's quite interesting. I used to have really mixed groups with people who came because they came. I had somebody. I'll tell you about a particular group. It was fascinating. A lady called Victoria, who got to 99, she had very, very poor short-term memory. She'd had a very interesting life, and she'd actually worked in London in the war, translating for de Gaulle in the French office. So, she had this incredible. She spoke many languages, a really interesting woman, and didn't even know she lived with her daughter anymore. But she remembered her memories were quite intact from those early years. And sitting next to her was somebody called Barry, who grew up in London, pretty much uneducated. He'd left school very young. If I had just looked at them on paper and said Barry's in that category, Victoria's in that category, I would have missed a trick because they were fantastic together. And what we discovered was they had a mutual love of poetry. And there was somebody else in the group who also loved poetry because he'd grown up in colonial India. And so he knew Robbie Burns and Kipling. And so we had that input. But the interesting thing about Barry was that he found poetry later in life, not through education. And one day he recited by rote, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. And you'll know that poem. And it was mesmerizing and everybody stopped. And that particular group became a lovely thing we used to do on Tuesday afternoons was we did poetry. We didn't do it on other groups. It was that particular group. And another lady in the group loved limericks and she loved Edward Lear. So everybody knew The Owl and the Pussycat. So we would talk about, and so, I do just think we should never prejudge people for what we think they are capable of, because we're all human, and actually humans are generally quite nice and supportive. And, we find that people understand that in our groups that other people have challenges too. And they tend to be quite kind to one another and supportive and understanding, sometimes a bit frustrated because if somebody's going around the loop with their memory and can't, where's my handbag? It's over there. Oh, right. Okay. And then 2 minutes later, where's my handbag? And sometimes it can be a bit repetitive, but that's part of memory loss, isn't it? But, it's fascinating to see how people do step up. And yeah, so I think, as I say, we'd miss a trick if we prejudge somebody purely demographically.
UK Health Radio. the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
You're in tune with the D-Word podcast, where I'm chatting to my guest, Libby Price from the Filo Project. And I think for, from a host perspective, they must learn a lot as well, because, I found when I was, and I still have a lot of friends who are living with dementia, and I love social history, and there's no better people.
No, exactly. Living memories, living history. There were little nuggets you get, which you and I won't have ever experienced. But I remember talking one day about, I don't know how we got onto the subject of now everybody showers every day, and, we have access to all the mod cons and everything. But back in the late 40s and early 40s or whatever, you had a bath once a week, and the bath was on a Friday, and the family would take it in turns, and the youngest would get in first and whatever. And, and those memories, listening to the light radio and or whatever they would listen to, those cameos of memory are fantastic. And, and with modern tools that we now have, so you can use live stream music. So, I found that there were times I used music a lot, not as an activity, but as a way of embellishing life. So, we would talk about something like that. And then I remember Roy, one of my clients, who would talk about what they would do after the bath was over. They would then sit down and listen to Eric Coates and that sort of, that kind of thing. And so I would bring that music into the room in that moment. And music is, as you know, I know you'll know this, but is a hugely important part of our lives. Our primary memory is based with music, and it transports us to a place where we often feel very safe and stable and comfortable and happy. So, and emotional. And we need to have that emotion. That's part of, again, being human, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is. I mean, we use Google Maps to show one of our members where he'd been evacuated to during the war, Small Valley. And he was unbelievable, because he was saying, oh, there's the post office. Well, if you turn left there, and it was, it was quite an incredible experience. Now, obviously, all this started down in the southwest. You've now expanded to Lancashire. I mean, it strikes me that, this is the future. This is what we need.
It is. But I think something that struck me the other day, and I felt really, I feel very passionate about, I hate the word passionate actually, but I feel very strongly that this is a model of care that is the right model of care for so many people. But unfortunately, we live in a world where it's a bit of a postcode lottery, depending on how the statutory system works. You may or may not be able to have it in your patch, So we have quite a good relationship, but it's not easy. But over time, with different local authorities, some are much better than others. Devon is hard work, but Cornwall is ahead of its game, really embraces the challenges that they have in Cornwall and the need to have a service like us. Same with Somerset, and Lancashire too, embracing us, want us there. And basically there's no reason why we can't be anywhere. Mainly, I think, less so into big cities, because I think you have the challenges of traffic, and part of our, as we've talked about, part of our model is the transport. So if you can't really be, you could be clogged up in traffic, and it would negate the whole value. Do you know what I mean? It's more challenging, but we know we work really well in more rural counties, such as East Lancashire, where we are now. Cornwall, Devon, Somerset are all very similar. So small towns, small cities. And when I say small, I mean, 120,000 is probably, Exeter, which is a small city. You can get to one side to the other quite easily. And that's a really, we know what we need to work. And it's basically that. But it's the engagement of a local authority to understand what it is that they need for the people they support. And I have to say something quite negative, and I've been pondering on it this week, because there's somebody lovely who reached out to me this week on LinkedIn, actually, about loving the model. And she's liked this model for some time, and I think probably is familiar with Shared Lives, which is, you know, is a national charity, and it's very particularly focused on, I think, learning disabilities and Downs and that sort of thing. So, but I don't know how much they deal with dementia. But she said that in her local authority, which I think is Portsmouth, just don't think it's right. They're not interested in for older people. And I thought, gosh, that to me, and I've been thinking about it. I've been mulling it over all week, and I thought to myself, why do they think it's not suitable? You know, why do they not want to invest? I don't mean invest necessarily financially, but just invest their energy and their emotion in getting something that's right. And I think it makes me sad, because I think it's a statement about older people. I think they're, you know, and we talk the talk, but do we walk the walk? And I think they should, shame on them that they don't think it's something that should be there for their older folk too, the people living with dementia. So I think that the thing I reflected on a lot this week, and I've been in some quite interesting meetings with strategic commissioners, and they're just some are just fantastic, and they're embracing the need, and they you know, looking at the long term and looking at aging and all the rest of it. And others are just sort of jobs worth, and they just tick boxes, and they just don't get involved in that decision making that they should. And it's frustrating, because it is a bit of a postcode lottery, Peter. I mean, we have local authorities that have expressed interest in us, but they're not prepared to make any investment to get us there with seed funding, which obviously it's quite costly for us to go into a new area, because we have to do feasibility. We have to, you know, it doesn't just happen. And we know, you know, it's only a question of, you know, there were many more out there who would like us to go. So I think we're working with 6 local authorities. But I won't go unless we do have that engagement, because I want our service to be for everybody, not just self-funders. And so you're with us regardless of your means. If you have the money to fund, then pay. And if you haven't, then you will be funded. Do you know what I mean? So that's really important.
Yeah, I got absolutely vital. I mean, all I can say is, you know, you keep on doing what you're doing with all the good people that work with you, and eventually we will all get a change, hopefully. It's been fascinating, Libby. Thank you so much for joining me and explaining about what I think is a really, really positive way forward.
Well, thank you, Peter. Well, it's been a pleasure to meet you, and I'm sure our paths will cross again.
Many thanks to Libby for a fascinating chat, and if you want to find out more, then there's lots of information on the Filo Project at www.thefiloproject.co.uk, and you can also find them on Twitter at the Filo Project. Well, that's all for this edition. Hope you've enjoyed it, and you'll join me again soon for another D-Word podcast.